So as can be seen from that video, the survey showed that culture and change are inextricably linked. Cultures have a massive influence on how effective change can be implemented. If, for example, if it's not a culture with open communication and honesty, and staff are not involved in the everyday sort of processes and projects, then they can be naturally resistant to change because they don't know what's going on. We've already hinted that change can be an issue in organisations where certain cultures exist. For example, if you've got a very strong role or power culture, such as the forces or the NHS, it could be a real battle to implement change, and people will stick to what they know. There could also be subcultures within the organisation, little microcultures where leaders or managers have particular power and they can sabotage things. If you're in a power or person culture and you're asked to get involved in change, you may not have been asked to participate before. You may not know how you can react. If the culture of the organisation seems to reinforce that communication is on a need-to-know basis, then how does communication that's open and honest needed to facilitate change take place? The results from the survey from over 2,200 organisations globally showed that only 50% felt their organisation had the capability to deliver change. That's quite horrifying, and that 84% though thought that culture was critically important, so it needs to be embedded in that culture. And only 50% of those people felt that their companies were good at managing culture. So I think it shows that we need to be better at managing culture so that we can make sure that things aren't going wrong as we try to make changes. Respondents also said that they felt their companies were falling short when they talked about the priority of the company's culture. So if we're accepting that culture is inherently linked with change, we need to be sure of what the culture is driving, and culture determines certain things. The culture will determine the roles, the power and the accountability, how information flows, how responsive people are to things within the organisation, whether they're innovative and looking for different new ideas and challenging the status quo, what their work ethic is, how the communication works between individuals and departments, and it will also impact on the well-being of the individual. And those things can drive certain parts of the change. So, for example, roles and power and accountability will drive the acceptance of the change and the involvement and where responsibility lies. It'll look at the information flow will affect the delivery of the change. The responsiveness might impact on the motivation and the input people feel they've got to have. Innovation might impact on the involvement and the suggestions they put forward. For example, if they're not being given the chance to be innovative, then they might find it hard to come up with suggestions and get involved. The work ethic could affect the attitude to change. If the ethic is that, we just turn up and we do what we're told when we're told, then the attitude to change might be slightly resistant. Communication will impact on the acceptance and the motivation if people feel they're not being told enough, if people feel they're not being informed. And finally, well-being and the overall effect will have an impact on the happiness and the effectiveness of employees. And if we haven't got happy, effective employees that buy into the change, then the chances of the change taking place effectively are pretty low. So the way we initiate and manage effective change is dependent on the culture of the organisation, so we need to be careful. And if we want inclusive change, which people buy into and believe in, we need a culture that creates that first. Often in a good organisation, sort of an enabled, empowering organisation with a good culture, change just happens. And it's down to the leadership within the organisation. But we need to remember some key things. We need to understand, we need to know the organisation's culture. What are we working with? How are we going to go about it? We may need to change that culture to make effective change. It needs effective leadership based on the task, the team and the situation. And we need to make sure that we're embedding cultural evolution. Cultures just don't stand still, and as people change, as times change, with all those factors we talked about, such as the internal and the external factors changing all the time, we need to make sure that we're embedding an evolution of cultural change and development. So let's just have a quick recap of what we've been over. One of our aims was to understand different leadership styles, and we've looked at a range of leadership styles. We've then looked at some theories, models, which show us how we can adapt those styles to suit different situations. And we've looked at the link between leadership styles and organisational culture, and how the organisational culture can drive the leadership style we use, or vice versa, the way we do our leadership can have an impact on the organisational culture. The second aim was to understand the importance of organisational culture, and in that we've looked at some different cultures that can exist within different organisations, and we've looked at a couple of models, and then we've analysed we've looked at the internal and external factors which can have an impact on that organisation's culture. So now we just need to look at what we need to do next. Right then, so we're going to have a look at what we need to do now before you move on to session 2. There's an activity for the sort of formative assessment at the end of this session. In part 1 of that, it's about examining the culture within your workplace. It asks you to think about the culture. How would you describe it? And are there any particular elements that are enabling or suppressing people? Remember, we looked at that balance between giving empowerment to people and enabling them, and how we could be in controlling them, which can be suppressing people. And think about the elements that you consider are intentional or are just inherent within your organization. So are they being created? Is there a reason for them, or are they just things that are inherent there, that have become one of those underlying assumptions that people have just continued to put in place? And then part 2 asks you to look at your leadership style and managing practices, and how that fits with the organization and your own skills. So does it fit in with the organizational culture, or do you find yourself battling against it, or are you following it and it's working? So have a go at that activity. Remember to reflect on what you're thinking about within your skill set and what you can do to change it as you look at that. And then when we move on to the next session, at session 2.